They said the plains kept their secrets well. Every dawn, the cowboy would see the same wild horse appear at the edge of his land, silent, unclaimed, scratching its hooves into the dirt of one lonely spot. Day after day, the animal returned relentless, as if bound by some hidden ritual. At first, he thought it was chance. Then he brought a shovel, and what he unearthed beneath the horse's vigil was not the work of time nor nature, but something buried that was never meant to be found. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. And if you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe. Elias Monroe had been riding west for most of his life, and the years had carved themselves into the lines of his face like wind across stone. He was 45 now, though he felt older, as if each cattle drive and border skirmish had added another year onto his bones. Sun and dust had tanned his skin to leather, and the deep-set eyes beneath the brim of his hat carried a quiet heaviness that no whiskey could ever soften. Tall and lean, his frame was hardened by decades of labor, mending fences, roping strays, guarding freight wagons through hostile passes. There was nothing soft about him, and yet something in the way he moved, measured, deliberate, almost weary, spoke of a man who had seen too much. The trail had given him everything and taken more. He could still see, if he let his mind wander, the moment a friend he'd ridden with since boyhood had gone down during a skirmish in Texas, shot from his saddle, while Elias watched helpless, pinned down by fire. The years since had been a blur of ranch work, half-hearted contracts, and nights spent under strange roofs, never belonging, never staying. It was as though life itself had become a string of temporary arrangements, each one ending with him back on the road, dust at his heels, silence in his chest. And silence, finally, was all he wanted. That was what led him north, away from the familiar trails, away from the talk of towns that always wanted to know your name and your history. Wyoming had seemed to call to him in a language only he could hear. Open land, wide skies, solitude, measured not by hours, but by miles of distance from another soul. He'd heard of a ranch up for near nothing abandoned years ago, after the family who owned it lost their fight against debt and weather. 50 acres, a house ready to fall in on itself, a barn leaning like an old drunk, and land that was more weeds and bramble than pasture. To most men, it was a ruin. To Elias, it sounded like salvation. So he signed what papers were needed, handed over a stack of bills that represented nearly all he'd saved, and pointed his horse north. He told himself this wasn't the end of his wandering, but the start of a different kind of exile, one chosen, one quiet. If the rest of the world carried on without him, all the better. The land stretched out before him in endless rolling silence. Wyoming in early autumn was a study in contrasts, the far peaks already wearing their first snow, while the low fields still burned gold with dry grass. The air smelled of pine resin and cold stone, and the wind swept across the flats with a sharpness that hinted at the long winter waiting just beyond the horizon. From a distance, the house appeared like a tired sentinel perched at the edge of the field, with its gray walls leaning into the wind. As Elias rode closer, the details sharpened into a portrait of neglect. The two-story frame house had once been painted white, but rain and time had stripped most of it away, leaving the boards a washed-out silver. Shingles curled up like old paper along the roof, and where the chimney leaned, cracks ran like scars down its sides. The porch sagged under its own weight, the steps moaning when he tested them with a boot. Off to one side, the red barn stooped like an old man with a bad back. Whole boards had pulled away gaps wide enough for swallows to dart in and out. The land itself stretched wider than his eyes could hold. 50 acres, most of it, untamed half, given over to waist-high grasses that swayed like an ocean, the other half to a stand of birch and pine that darkened toward the foothills. Out here, The nearest town lay more than 20 miles back, along the rutted road, and no sound carried but the wind and the occasional harsh cry of a crow. For most men, the ranch was a failed dream. For Elias, it was exactly right. He swung down from his horse boots, crunching in the dry dirt. The animal snorted, tossing its head, but Elias only patted its neck and loosened the cinch. He carried the saddle across the porch and set it just inside the door, the wood groaning beneath him. For a long while, he simply stood there on the threshold, looking out at the sweep of land, as though measuring the depth of his own isolation. "This is it," he murmured under his breath, though there was no one to hear it. And that was the point. No one to ask him about the scars on his hands, no one to mention the names of men long buried, no one to expect him at church or the saloon. Just land, air, and whatever work he could put his hands to. The silence pressed against him, heavy but clean, like a weight he might finally learn to bear. The wind hissed through the birch leaves. A crow let out a harsh call before vanishing into the trees. Beyond that, nothing. No wagons, no distant gunfire, no laughter spilling out of some dance hall. Elias stood on the porch and let the stillness seep into him until his shoulders loosened. For the first time in years, he did not feel watched by memory. Work came easily to a man who had known little else. The first day he split kindling until his palms burned, stacking it neat against the side of the house. At nightfall, when the air turned sharp, he built a fire in the stone hearth, coaxing warmth into walls that smelled of dust and old pine sap. The next morning, he walked the line of the fence, testing each post, replacing those that leaned with new cedar he cut from the trees behind the barn. He strung rusted wire tight, listening to its twang like a note of music. The barn roof sagged in more places than he could count, but he climbed anyway, hammer in hand, patching what he could with salvaged boards. Rain would find its way in regardless, but each nail he drove was a small victory. He made lists in his head, breaking the overwhelming into pieces. Today mend the south fence, tomorrow. Clear brush from the field the day after, shore up the porch supports. Each task became a mission, and missions he understood. Work left no room for memory to creep and no gaps for old ghosts to whisper. By the time the sun set each day, his muscles ached enough to drown out everything else. And he found comfort in that ache. Evenings came with a rhythm he began to depend on. When the last light bled over the ridges, Elias would sit on the porch steps with a battered tin cup in hand, steam curling from the coffee he drank black. The air grew cool quickly, carrying the scent of pine smoke from the chimney, and the dry sweetness of grass turned to seed. From where he sat, the whole valley seemed to exhale crows, settling shadows, lengthening the mountains in the distance, blushing pink before surrendering to night. He would sit there long after the cup emptied his boots, planted firm on the worn step, listening to the quiet. Sometimes he thought of speaking aloud, just to hear a voice, but he never did. Instead, he let the silence settle over him like a blanket. The fire in the hearth behind him popped and crackled. The last streaks of daylight vanished, replaced by the slow unfurling of stars. It was in those moments alone, coffee still warm in his hands, the land stretching wide and indifferent, that Elias Monroe began to believe he might finally find what he'd been chasing all along. Not peace, perhaps, but a kind of stillness earned one day at a time. The days had settled into a rhythm Elias Monroe could almost trust. He rose with the sun, worked until his hands grew raw, and collapsed into the quiet evenings with little more than a fire and the sound of wind in the trees. It was a pattern simple and without memory, and he had begun to think he might build a life inside it. Late one afternoon, with the sun already dipping toward the horizon, Elias carried an axe across the field to gather the last of the fallen branches near the south fence. The day had been long, the kind of day where sweat cooled quick on the skin, and the air seemed to hold its breath before dusk. The fence held mostly, though there were posts that leaned and wire that sagged. He made note of them in silence, adding them to the endless ledger of work waiting to be done. The light had changed, by then poured out gold across the grasses, every blade tipped in fire. From the tree line far beyond, crows lifted into the air with harsh, echoing cries, their black wings ragged against the sky. Elias paused to listen. In that vast openness, each sound became sharper, the scrape of his boot through the grass, the rasp of his horse breathing somewhere behind him, the creak of leather as he adjusted the axe against his shoulder. The world seemed to pare down to essentials: wind earth, man-animal, and the hush between them. That was when he saw it. At first he thought his eyes had found a trick of shadow at the edge of the pasture. But the longer he stared, the clearer it became. A horse stood on the far side, no more than 100 yards distant, poised in the fading light, as though it had been carved there by dusk itself. It was tall, its frame proud and unbroken. The coat shimmered silver gray beneath the sun's last strength, catching each ray until it looked as though it glowed. Its mane rippled when the wind caught it, long strands lifting and falling like a banner. Elias froze where he was, boots rooted in the grass. He'd seen mustangs before, lean survivors that haunted the hills, but there was something different here. The animal did not graze. It did not paw nervously or stamp as wild horses often did when they caught a man's scent. Instead, it stood motionless, head-high eyes, fixed not on Elias, but on a patch of field just ahead of where it lingered. He followed its gaze, but saw nothing, only grass swaying under the weight of shadow. He turned back to the horse, but by then, it had already shifted one quick toss of its head. And then it wheeled, slipping into the trees, with a fluid grace that left the grass trembling in its wake. In a heartbeat, it was gone. Elias let out the breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The next day passed in the same fashion. Work, sweat, a meal taken alone. By the time the sun reached its low arc and the crows began their nightly chorus, Elias found himself drifting toward the south fence again, almost without intention. And there it was. In the same place, at nearly the same time, the silver-gray horse had returned. Once again it held still, mane catching the breeze, eyes locked on that invisible point across the field. It did not move toward him, nor away. It did not graze. It only watched. Minutes stretched thin. Elias felt the strange weight of the animal's presence, the way it anchored the fading day. Finally, as if satisfied with its silent vigil, the horse turned and slipped back into the trees, vanishing like mist at sunrise. The third day, it came again. And the fourth. Always in the same place, always at the same hour, as though the horse had stitched itself into the very pattern of the land. Elias began to wait for it, though he would not admit it aloud. He would find himself pausing in his work, as the sun bent low, glancing toward the edge of the field, as though pulled by a thread he could not see. And there, it would be a sentinel of silver, keeping its silent watch. It never approached. It never spooked at his presence. It never touched its nose to the grass, only stood. The repetition unsettled him. Animals lived by instinct, by hunger and flight, not by ritual. Yet here was this creature arriving with the precision of a clock, leaving only when the sky had fully dimmed. At first, Elias told himself there must be some simple cause. Perhaps the grass grew sweeter there, though he never once saw the horse lower its head to taste it. Perhaps it was coincidence, a wandering pattern his mind had decided to order. He even muttered it aloud one evening, testing the sound of it against the silence. Just a patch of sweet grass, that's all. Nothing more. But the words rang false the moment they left his mouth. Because it wasn't grass the animal came for. He remembered the way its ears had never flicked toward him in alarm, the way its body carried no tension, no instinct to flee. Instead, it had stood with the calm intent of something waiting. And the strangest part, it wasn't waiting for him. The thought pressed into him like a cold hand. He watched the animal one evening, its gaze steady on that same stretch of field, and something inside him whispered, "You're not here to eat, are you? You're standing watch." For what? For who? The whisper turned to words before he could stop himself. "There's something under there, isn't there, friend?" he said quietly into the dusk. His voice felt too loud, startling, even in his own ears. The horse 100 yards away did not stir. Elias rubbed a hand across his jaw and shook his head, trying to laugh at his own fancy. Yet when the horse disappeared again into the tree line, the unease lingered. He carried it with him back to the house, back to the fire, back into sleep that came late and restless. Days stretched, each one a mirror of the last. The ranch demanded his hands and his sweat, but his mind drifted more often toward that silver figure at the edge of the field. Each return deepened the pattern until Elias no longer believed in chance. This was something else, something deliberate, though what it sought to show him he could not yet name. And so he kept his distance. He did not ride closer. He did not whistle or calls out. He watched measured and wary as one survivor might watch another across the divide of silence. Some nights, sitting on the porch with coffee cooling in his hands, he would replay the image, the horse still as stone eyes pinned to the earth, and the thought would come again, heavy, unshakable. It's not here for the grass. It's here for what lies beneath. By the 5th evening, Elias no longer questioned whether the horse would appear. He'd finished his work early that day, stacking cut logs along the barn wall, tightening a section of fence, and when the sun began to slip toward the mountains, he found himself on the porch, coffee cooling between his palms, waiting without admitting it to himself. Sure enough, when the hour turned, a faint movement at the edge of the pasture caught his eye. The silver-gray horse stepped out of the tree line and took up its post just as it had the 4 evenings before. But this time was different. Instead of standing rigid, as though carved from the dusk, the horse lowered its head. Elias heard it before he fully understood what it was doing, and the sharp clatter of hooves against earth, not the rhythmic stamp of impatience, but a deliberate digging. The sound carried in the wind, hollow and repetitive, each strike landing with stubborn intent. He leaned forward, mug forgotten in his hand, as dirt began to spray outward from beneath the animal's legs. The horse worked with a strange ferocity, striking the ground again and again, driving its hooves into the same spot. Evening deepened, shadows pooling in the grass, and still it labored. Elias felt the hair on his arms rise at the sight. The sound of hoof on soil was steady, insistent, unnatural in its purpose. Only when the last of the light bled from the horizon did the horse finally still. It lifted its head sides, heaving, and without so much as a glance toward Elias, it turned back into the trees. Left behind in the field was a shallow scar in the earth, a dark oval that caught the moonlight like an open wound. The next day, Elias worked near the barn, his eyes drawn again and again to the distant edge of the pasture. The soil where the horse had pawed looked no different from the rest. Wind had softened the sharp edges, and the grasses leaned inward as though to hide the disturbance. But Elias knew, and as the sun dipped low, the horse returned. It moved to the same place with eerie precision, standing squarely over the scar of earth it had made. For a long moment, it was still the gold light washing its silver coat mane, lifting in the breeze. Then, with a sharp toss of its head, It resumed the ritual. Hooves struck in the same rhythm, dirt flying the wound in the earth, deepening by inches. Elias set down his hammer and tools, leaning against the porch post to watch. He felt it then, a shift inside him, the certainty that this was no idle habit. Wild horses did not waste strength on meaningless acts. They ran, they grazed, they fought for mates, but they did not return day after day to the same patch of earth to dig. This was something else. The days blurred together, each one repeating the last. Elias found himself timing his chores so he could watch the ritual unfold, as though compelled to bear witness. Every evening, the horse came. Every evening it dug with that same grim determination. It never grazed. It never drank. It did not so much as flick an ear in Elias's direction. Its entire being seemed focused on the soil beneath its hooves, as if the world narrowed to that single patch of ground. By the end of the week, the shallow scrape had become a visible hollow, perhaps a foot deep, jagged and raw in the grass. Elias's chest tightened every time he saw it. He knew instinct when he saw it, and this did not belong to any instinct he could name. On the 8th evening, he carried his old field glasses with him. They were scratched and the leather casing cracked with age, but the lenses still held clarity. Standing on the porch, he raised them to his eyes and fixed the glass on the horse. What he saw unsettled him. The animal was drenched in focus. Muscles rippled along its flanks as it drove hooves into the ground, dirt flying in hard clumps. Its tail lashed with each strike, not in irritation, but as if to anchor its effort. It worked until sweat darkened its coat, until its breath came ragged and visible even in the fading light. This was no idle behavior. This was compulsion. Elias lowered the glasses slowly, the weight of unease pressing against his chest. He had once heard soldiers talk of cavalry mounts that refused to cross certain ground, claiming the animals could smell blood long dried. Another time, a grizzled scout swore a horse had unearthed the shallow grave of a fallen man days after a skirmish. Elias had laughed it off then like everyone else. But the memory crept back now with a cold hand. What if this animal was not simply restless? What if it had caught the faint trace of something human, something buried? The thought chilled him more than he wanted to admit. That night, the moon rose bright, silvering the field in pale light. Elias found himself restless, drawn to the fence line, as if the night itself had whispered for him to come. He stood with his hands resting on the rough wood, his shadow stretching long across the grass. And the horse was there. It had paused in its digging head, lifted breath steaming in the cold. Its eyes caught the moonlight glimmering with a strange, unearthly brightness. For the first time it was looking at him. They held each other's gaze across the distance, neither moving, the silence stretching taut. The air felt heavy, charged with a meaning Elias could not name. The words escaped him before he could swallow them. "There's something under there, isn't there, friend?" His voice carried softly across the night, half question, half confession. The horse did not move, did not snort, did not shift. Yet, in the luminous calm of its eyes, Elias felt the answer. Not in words, but in certainty, as if the creature had spoken in a language older than speech. Then with a slow exhale, the horse turned back to the soil, lowered its head, and struck again. Elias gripped the fence rail, the truth settling in him like a weight, whatever lay buried beneath that ground. The horse would not stop until it was found. Elias Monroe had not slept well for nights. He lay on the narrow bed in the farmhouse, listening to the sigh of the wind through the gaps in the walls, the faint pop of cooling wood in the stove, and the silence that always followed after. But it was not peace that filled him. It was the image of the horse. Night after night, he saw it in his mind, the silver-gray Mustang standing at the edge of the pasture, head bent to the earth hooves, striking with unrelenting force. He could almost hear the dull thud of its ritual digging echoing in his skull. And each time he told himself the same lie, that it was chance, that it was instinct, that the horse was nothing but an animal repeating some unknowable habit. Yet when dawn broke, he knew the truth. If there was no meaning to it, the horse would have stopped. But it had not. On the 6th night of restless turning, he sat up, swung his legs over the side of the bed, and whispered into the dark, "If I don't try, I'll never know. And then I'll never rest." The decision hung in the still air, like a vow. At first light, with dew soaking the grass and mist still curling low across the field, Elias gathered his tools. A shovel with a worn wooden handle, a heavy-bladed hoe for breaking soil, a pair of leather gloves, stiff with age. He slung them over his shoulder and stepped out into the cool air. The horse was already there. It stood exactly where it always had silver hide, gleaming pale against the dim horizon, head high and ears forward as though waiting. Elias paused for a long moment, caught by the uncanny sense that the animal had known what he would do, before even he had admitted it to himself. Morning Elias muttered, voice rough from disuse. He adjusted the weight of the tools and crossed the grass toward the shallow scar the horse had left. The animal did not flee, did not spook, did not so much as shift its weight. It merely watched as Elias dropped the hoe to the ground, pushed the shovel's blade into the damp earth, and began. The soil gave way easily, at first dark and moist from the night air. Elias dug where the horse's hooves had already broken the surface, widening the shallow hollow into a rough pit. Each thrust of the shovel sent clumps of earth rolling aside. The rhythm came back to him, the set of his shoulders, the lean of his weight, the pull of his arms. He had dug trenches before, in work and in war, and the memory rode in his muscles like an old song. But the ground here was tangled with roots that clawed at the blade, with buried stones that jarred the haft against his palms. Sweat rose quickly across his back, despite the morning chill. He gritted his teeth, pressed harder. The field was still save for the sound of iron-biting soil. Each scrape and thud seemed to echo across the silence. The only other sound was the steady breath of the horse standing nearby. Every time Elias glanced up, the animal's eyes were on him, sharp and unblinking. Once, it snorted softly, tossing its head as though urging him to continue. He muttered, half to himself, half to the horse, "You've done your part. Now it's mine." And he kept digging. Nearly an hour passed before anything changed. The pit was waist-deep now, and Elias's arms ached with the strain of swinging the shovel. He drove the blade in again, livering up a heavy clump of dirt, and then froze. A hollow sound had risen from beneath the steel, a sharp ringing cock, unlike the muffled give of stone or root. Elias straightened breath quick and struck again, more carefully this time. The same sound answered, not earth, not wood, but metal. Heart thudding, he dropped to his knees, scraping with the shovel blade, then with gloved hands. Damp soil crumbled away, revealing the faint gleam of a surface hidden beneath. It was flat cold against his fingertips and coated in a dark crust that flaked away under his touch. Metal. A sheet of it broad and unyielding. Elias sat back on his heels, dirt streaking his gloves, his breath loud in his ears. Whatever this was, it was not debris scattered by chance. No farmer buried iron plate in the middle of a field. This was deliberate. This was hidden. The horse had stopped breathing so heavily. It stood at the rim of the pit neck, stretched forward, ears pricked. Elias felt the weight of its attention as surely as the weight of the shovel in his hands. "You knew," he whispered more to himself than to the animal. The words made his skin prickle. He needed leverage now. A shovel would not do. He climbed from the pit muscles, trembling from exertion, and strode back across the field to the barn. Inside, among piles of rusted nails and rotting timber, he found the tool he sought, a long iron crowbar, heavy as sin. Its surface was pitted with age, but the steel was still true. Back at the pit, he dropped into the hole and wedged the crowbar's edge beneath a seam of soil that clung to the metal plate. He bore down, muscles straining until the bars shrieked against the buried surface. Flakes of rust and dirt broke free, filling the air with the sharp tang of iron long hidden. He worked around the edge, prying, forcing. Each time the bar bit deeper, the shape of it became clearer. Not a jagged scrap, not a broken machine, but a panel broad, flat, and unnatural in the earth. Elias pressed harder, sweat running into his beard, until a section of the plate shifted with a low groan, the sound of metal that had not seen the air in decades. He stumbled back, chest heaving. In the dim pit, enough of the surface now lay exposed to reveal its unnatural breadth. This was not debris. This was a structure. And it had been buried on purpose. The horse lifted its head and screamed. It was not the sharp, nervous whinny of an animal spooked. It was a long, ringing call that rolled out across the empty land, high and resonant, carrying through the trees like a horn. Elias felt the sound in his bones, a cry of triumph and warning all at once. When it ended, the Mustang stamped the earth 3 times each blow, echoing like punctuation. Then, its stilled eyes burning in the morning light, gaze fixed on Elias. He stood in the pit, crowbar still in his hands, heart pounding. The meaning of the gesture pressed into him with the weight of certainty. The horse had shown him what it had guarded. It had led him to this. And now it was telling him, in the only language it possessed, "This is it. This is what I've waited for you to see." Elias swallowed hard, the taste of rust on his tongue, and nodded once. "All right, friend," he said hoarsely. "We'll see what lies beneath." The field fell silent again, but the silence was no longer empty. It was charged, alive, waiting. The hole grew larger with every stroke of the shovel. Elias's body moved like a machine, sweat cutting trails through the grime on his face, gloves slick with dirt. The crowbar and shovel took turns in his hands as he widened the pit, pulling earth away from the iron plate he had uncovered. What had seemed at first like a simple sheet of metal soon proved otherwise. The shape curved. He crouched, tracing it with his palm, feeling the bend of it beneath the clinging soil. This wasn't flat wreckage, no discarded sheet left behind by some forgotten farmer. This was part of something larger. He dug further, loosening clods of earth from the sides, his breath harsh in the morning air. Slowly, a rounded line revealed itself, arched, deliberate. He scraped back more soil and saw the faint outline of a wheel iron rim, eaten through with rust, half swallowed by decades of earth. The spokes had collapsed, crumbling at his touch, but their pattern was clear. A wheel, which meant what lay beneath was not random. It was whole. Elias leaned back, a blinking sweat from his eyes. His stomach twisted, equal parts anticipation and dread. A wagon. It had to be. The horse stood close to the pit now, so close Elias could hear its steady breath above him. Its mane rippled with each breeze, and its dark eyes never left his work. Elias felt the scrutiny like a hand pressing at his back. "All right," he muttered, shoving the shovel back into the earth. "Let's see what the hell they buried." Hours passed in a blur of labor. Soil piled around him in mounded ridges, roots torn and flung aside. By midday, the outline of the wagon emerged, grotesque in its preservation. The wooden skeleton had rotted to splinters, but the iron fittings endured, the rims of 2 wheels bent but intact. The axle rusted but recognizable. The steel bands that once bound its frame. Where boards had collapsed, earth had flowed in, swallowing the interior. Yet the shape was undeniable, 4 wheels a box-like hull. A driver's seat half disintegrated, but still clinging to the front. He scraped at the side with his gloves, fingers finding paint hidden beneath grime. A pale color too faint to name. He rubbed harder. White. Beneath the streaks of soil, white paint clung stubbornly dulled by years underground. Along its edge, a faint line of red appeared a border, once sharp, now little more than a scar of color. Elias's pulse quickened. He wiped more fiercely, hand aching, until letters took form. Bent, almost erased, but still there. M.E.D. He cleared more, tracing them with trembling fingers. Medical supply. The words stared back at him, crooked but clear, etched into the wagon's side. Elias sank back onto his heels, chest, rising and falling. His breath came sharp, almost painful. The air around him felt colder, as if the sun itself had recoiled from what he'd uncovered. A supply wagon. For medicine. Buried like a corpse in the middle of nowhere. The silver horse stood at the edge of the pit main, lifting in the wind. Its eyes seemed brighter, fixed on Elias, as if demanding that he accept what he had found. He sat heavily on the rim of the pit dust, clinging to his sweat-soaked shirt. His mind churned with questions that had no answers. Why in God's name would anyone bury a wagon? He muttered, a loud voice, rough with disbelief. It was absurd. Wagons broke, yes. They were abandoned by trailsides, left to rot in fields, cannibalized for spare iron and wood. But they were never buried, not like this. Not whole. And certainly not wagons meant to carry medicine. He dragged a hand over his face, smearing grit into his beard. To enter such a thing in the earth would have taken hours, days even. Whoever had done it hadn't sought to discard, but to conceal. The thought struck him like a hammer blow. This was a grave. Not for a person, not yet, though the unease in his stomach told him that 2 might come, but for truth itself. Someone had gone to terrible lengths to make sure this wagon would never be seen again. Elias shivered despite the heat of his labor. The horse gave a sharp snort, stamping one hoof against the ground. The sound cracked the silence, sharp as a warning, sharp as an affirmation. Elias lifted his head, met the creature's gaze, and felt something pass between them. "You think so too, don't you?" he whispered. "There's something here no one wanted found." The horse blew through its nostrils, tossing its mane, and Elias knew it was answer enough. He pushed himself to his feet, the decision heavy but inevitable. He could walk away, leave the wagon sealed in its dirt tomb, return to the ranch house, and let the land keep its silence. But he knew the thought was a lie the moment it formed. If he stopped now, the hole in the earth would follow him. The questions would follow him. He would never know what had been hidden, and the weight of it would gnaw at him until he broke. "No," he said, a loud voice steady now. "If you've shown me this, friend, then I'll see it through." He stepped back from the pit, eyeing the warped structure with the knowledge of a man who had built and torn down barns, who had pried open wagons mired in mud. The back end of the vehicle faced upward at an angle, buried but intact. If there was any entrance left to it, it would be the rear door. He scanned the seams, dirt packed tight into the cracks. The hinges were likely rusted solid, but the frame still clung stubbornly to shape. With the right leverage, with enough force, he might pry it open. It was no simple chore, but then nothing worth doing ever was. He climbed from the pit, muscles sore and caked in soil, and strode back across the field to the barn. Inside, he rummaged until he found what he needed: a heavy crowbar, nearly as tall as himself, a short-handled sledge with a cracked wooden grip, and a tin lamp he filled with oil and struck a light. The flicker of flame threw long shadows across the rotten boards. and Elias carried it like a talisman against the dark thoughts clawing at his mind. By the time he returned to the pit, the sun had sunk low, painting the horizon in deep amber. The air had cooled, the wind sharpening against his sweat-damp skin. He lowered himself into the hole once more, tools clattering softly against metal as he set them down. The horse had not left. It stood sentinel above him, mane stirring in the gathering dusk, its eyes gleaming as if it too knew the hour had come. The crowbar bit deep into the seam, the handle vibrating against Elias's palms. He leaned all his weight onto it, then lifted the sledgehammer and brought it down in heavy arcs. The blows rang sharp in the evening air, metal shrieking as rust gave way. Each strike peeled flakes of iron oxide from the hinges, raining down in reddish dust that clung to his arms and face like blood. The door groaned, but held. He did not stop. Blow after blow, grunt after grunt, until his shoulders burned and his breath came ragged. At last, with a thunderous crack, the hinge surrendered. The wagon shuddered as the rear door tore loose and swung open, falling outward on a cascade of rust and soil. Elias stumbled back, nearly losing his footing in the pit. For a moment, he only leaned on the crowbar chest, heaving sweat dripping from his brow. The silence that followed was enormous. Then, with shaking hands, he lifted the lamp and raised its glow toward the wagon's gaping interior. He expected to see crates stacked high, the remnants of bandages and glass bottles, maybe the rusted shell of some surgeon's kit. But the light revealed something else entirely. A wall of dirt. The lamplight flickered across an earthen barrier pressed solid from floor to roof. Packed clay, stone, and silt filled the wagon's interior from end to end, rammed so tight it looked like it had been carved into place. Elias blinked, disbelieving, then reached forward to touch it. His fingers pressed against the wall. It was cold, dense, unyielding. He tapped it with the crowbar. The sound was dull, muffled, as though it had been hammered into permanence. Someone had filled the wagon deliberately. He drew back, stomach twisting. Why bury a wagon only to choke it with dirt from the inside? What purpose could it serve but one, a grave? A coffin disguised as a vehicle. The thought chilled him deeper than the autumn air. His hand trembled on the lamp, throwing shadows that seemed to writhe along the pit's walls. No. He muttered, voice too thin to comfort himself. This isn't chance. Somebody made it this way. Above him, the silver-gray horse blew hard through its nostrils, stamping once against the soil. Elias felt the sound echo through his bones. He swallowed. He could turn away, seal the door again, let the earth keep its silence. But already his body moved, hovering him half inside the suffocating cavity, shovel in hand. The truth waited here, and he would not rest until he knew it. The air grew heavy as he dug. Each stroke of the small shovel carved into the packed earth, each clawful of dirt released a stale, sour smell, clay, mixed with rust, mold, and age. The lamplight glimmered weakly against the close-packed soil, throwing the hollow into a claustrophobic glow. He worked slow, pulling handfuls of dirt into a bucket he dragged down into the pit, dumping it behind him. Sweat stung his eyes, and every scrape of iron against the clay rang like a strike against a tombstone. Half a foot in his shovel struck something that wasn't earth. Not stone either, something softer, fibrous. He froze, heart knocking in his ribs. With trembling hands, he brushed soil aside. A strap of cracked leather emerged, slick with damp trailing from a sagging shape. He tugged carefully, and the object slid free, a satchel, its body swollen and rotted, the flap eaten through by time. He set it down outside the wagon, wiping grime from its surface. In the glow of the lamp, he could see faint stitching, the shape of compartments meant to hold instruments. A nurse's bag. Elias sat back, a throat tight. His fingers hovered over the ruined satchel, afraid to open it, afraid of what it might once have held. Instead, he only pushed it aside, trying to steady his breath. The horse above him stamped and tossed its head, letting out a low, rolling snort. The sound was restless, urgent, like a warning. Elias wiped sweat from his brow and turned back to the wall. He dug on. The next find was smaller, hidden in the dirt like a spark. His shovel caught on it, and something metallic tumbled into the lamplight. Elias reached for it, brushing soil from its surface. It was an earring, a delicate piece of silver shaped into a hummingbird, with wings outstretched, tarnished from years of burial. Despite its dullness, it caught the light of the flame and glimmered faintly like a living thing. Elias's throat closed. Jewelry? A woman's jewelry. He turned it over in his palm, staring at the small hook bent and rusted, the intricate detail of the wings. There was no mistaking what it was or what it meant. Christ, he whispered. His hand shook so badly he nearly dropped it. The horse above him whickered sharply, pawing at the ground with nervous insistence. Elias felt the weight of the animal's presence pressing down like judgment. This wasn't a supply wagon abandoned and hidden. This was a tomb, a woman's tomb. His breath quickened. He looked at the packed earth still looming ahead, his chest tightening as though the walls of the wagon pressed in on him. He knew he should stop. Every instinct screamed for him to stop, but his hands refused. He kept digging. It came suddenly. His shovel struck something that gave with a brittle snap. The sound was wrong, neither rock nor root. Elias froze, sweat dripping from his chin, then set the shovel aside. His hands moved on their own, clawing at the dirt, pulling it free handful by handful. And then he saw it. Pale, fragile, curved like a question. A bone, not animal, too small, too human. He brushed more away, and the shape of fingers emerged, curled in eternal clutch, the ivory of bone, wrapped still in tatters of fabric, long rotted. A hand. Elias staggered back, the breath torn from his lungs. The lamp shook in his grasp, shadows leaping madly over the wagon's interior. The tiny bones gleamed grotesque and intimate. The sight rooted him to the spot. God Almighty. His voice cracked and failed. He fell to his knees at the edge of the pit, staring at the hand protruding from the dirt. The hummingbird earring glimmered beside it. The nurse's bag lay slumped in the lamplight, mute testimony. Piece by piece, the truth assembled itself in his mind. A medical wagon buried like refuse. The interior packed with dirt to hide what lay inside. A woman's satchel, a woman's jewelry. A hand skeletal and still. Not chance, not accident, not abandonment. Murder. The wagon was no grave of tools. It was a coffin for a woman. Someone had gone to terrible lengths to conceal her body, to erase her from the land. Elias's chest heaved. The air around him felt colder, the silence crushing. He bowed his head, gripping the edge of the pit until his knuckles blanched. Lord have mercy, he rasped. This was a crime. This was a life taken. Above him, the horse lifted its head to the darkening sky and screamed. The cry cut through the twilight like a blade, high and keening, a sound that was no longer just an animal's voice. It was grief, it was rage, it was a mourning wail for the dead. The sound rolled across the prairie, echoing in the trees, tearing apart the silence that had held the land for 30 years. Elias closed his eyes, heart pounding as the truth of the grave pressed down on him. The secret had been unearthed, and nothing would ever be silent here again. Elias carried the satchel up from the pit with both hands, setting it gently on the porch table, as though it might disintegrate at the slightest rough touch. The straps had long since rotted, the buckles crusted with green corrosion, and the leather itself had the sickly, waxy feel of something that had been left too long in the damp. Even the smell of it made him grimace mildew, rust, and something older, sour with age. He lit another lamp, its glow spreading across the warped boards of the porch, and sat down before the bag. His gloves were black with dirt, but he pulled them off and laid them aside. This was no chore for clumsy hands. The clasp broke away with barely a tug. Inside lay the remnants of a healer's trade, a stethoscope mottled with rust, the tubing cracked and split. A pair of small surgical scissors fused shut by corrosion. Rolls of linen bandage stiff with mold crumbling at the edges. Artifacts of care turned relics by time. And at the bottom, pressed flat against the decaying leather, was a book. It was bound in thin hide. The cover warped its spine, swollen from moisture. Elias lifted it carefully, dust drifting from its surface, and laid it flat on the table. The pages curled like dried leaves, mottled with black stains where mold had crept in. Yet when he thumbed the first page open, he found words still there, written in a neat, flowing hand. At the top, in faded ink, was a name: Sarah Hayes. Elias sat back, lamp flame trembling in his eyes. He whispered the name aloud, as though speaking it would make the dead woman real again. The journal opened a window to another life. Sarah Hayes. A traveling nurse, the words revealed, working for the scattered camps of Blackwood Mine. She had driven her medical wagon up into the mountains, across valleys, down forgotten trails, anywhere men broke bones, or women bore children, or children sickened in the cold. She had tended miners who collapsed from exhaustion, stitched the wounds of men cut open by falling rock, soothed children with fevers when their mothers wept in despair. The early pages carried the cadence of a woman who had believed in her purpose. She wrote about weather that froze her fingers stiff on the reins, about days when the sun poured like fire, and she had to water her horse twice before noon. She mentioned names, families in the mining camp, men who tipped their hats to her as she passed children who clutched sweets she sometimes carried in her bag. There was joy in her words. Brief but luminous, a miner who recovered from a crushed leg and walked again, a child's fever breaking after long nights of watching. Elias read slowly, lips moving as he traced each line. He could almost see her in his mind's eye, a young woman, weary but resolute, guiding her painted wagon into the wild places of Wyoming. He imagined the set of her jaw as she held a lantern over a patient, the softness of her hands binding wounds. She had been more than a nurse. She had been hope carried on wheels. The thought made his stomach twist, for he knew how her story had ended. The contrast between the woman in the pages and the bones he had uncovered was almost too much to bear. As the pages turned, the tone shifted. The writing lost its lightness. The words became shorter, sharper, weighted with unease. A new name began to surface in the lines again and again: Franklin Creed. At first, she wrote of him as though he were a benefactor, a man of wealth, owner of land and contracts, who brought supplies to the camp, who offered to help when others turned away. She noted his visits, his questions, the way he lingered near her wagon when she returned from a long day's work. But soon her tone soured. His kindness was not kindness at all. It was scrutiny. A tension that grew heavier, closer, until it pressed the air out of her chest. She wrote of his eyes following her when she tried to work, of his words edged with entitlement. At first he offered help, she scrawled on one page, but now I feel caged. He speaks as though my time belongs to him, as though my very body were part of his holdings. When I meet his gaze, I feel less than human, like an object he's already purchased. Elias's grip on the journal tightened until his knuckles whitened. He could almost hear her voice trembling between the lines. It was more than fear. It was protest smothered by a man who had power to make the world believe she was his. The lamp hissed softly beside him, and the night wind pressed against the house, carrying the faint rustle of grass. Elias closed his eyes for a moment, jaw tight. The pages grew darker still. The script turned hurried, crooked, written with a shaking hand. Sarah described confrontations, moments when Creed's patience cracked. She wrote of refusing something, though she did not name it outright. She wrote of his temper, the way his face changed when she denied him. She wrote of the threats. He told me that no one would listen, that no one would dare cross him. He said if I spoke, he would silence me forever. I believe him. The final entries were almost illegible, the ink smeared by haste, by hands that trembled too much to form letters cleanly. I cannot leave. He has men in every camp, and I know they watch me. I am afraid, but I will not give in. If anyone finds this, know that I did not vanish. I was taken. The sentence broke off. After that, nothing but blank pages, warped and brittle. Elias stared at the abrupt ending until his vision blurred. He pressed the journal shut with both hands, as if to keep the weight of its truth from spilling further into the night. His chest felt heavy, his breath shallow. He sat long on the porch, the lamplight swaying, the night pressing in around him. The leather-bound book lay across his knees, Sarah Hayes's name still visible on the cover, a voice reaching across 30 years of silence. Her bones lay in the wagon, in the earth. Her words lay in his hands, and together they formed a truth that could not be denied. The wind keened through the birches, making the house groan as if it too carried sorrow. Elias looked up from the book toward the pasture. There, in the silver wash of moonlight, stood the gray horse. It had not left, not once. Its body gleamed like smoke, and steel its head, bowed as though listening. Their eyes met across the field. In that gaze, Elias felt the enormity of what had been unearthed, not just a woman's death, but the burial of justice itself. This isn't just your secret anymore. He whispered the words trembling out of him. It's ours. And it's time it was brought to light. The horse lifted its head higher, mane catching the wind, and for a moment Elias could swear it understood. He pressed the journal to his chest and closed his eyes. In the silence that followed, the only sound was the steady beat of his own heart, carrying both burden and vow. The night after Elias finished reading Sarah Hayes's journal, he barely slept. He sat with the book on the table in front of him, its swollen pages heavy with mildew, its words burned into his mind. Each line replayed itself when he closed his eyes, the careful notations of a healer, the sudden trembling hand of a woman afraid, and that final desperate warning. If anyone finds this, know that I did not vanish. I was taken. The memory of her skeletal hand, fingers curled as though still clinging to life, haunted him even more. He could still feel the brittle weight of the bone when he'd brushed it free from the packed soil. It was not the kind of thing a man could ignore. For hours he argued with himself. He had bought this land for silence. He had sought out solitude, thinking it would free him from the ghosts of his own life. And now another ghost had been laid in his hands. He could bury the evidence again, lock the journal away, and pretend it was none of his business. But that thought twisted in his gut, filling him with shame. By dawn, he knew there was no choice left. If I stay quiet, he muttered into the morning air, she stays buried forever. So he saddled his bay gelding, packed the satchel with the nurse's bag, the hummingbird earring, and Sarah's journal, and turned his horse toward town. The ride was long, over 20 miles of empty Wyoming country. The sun rose at his back, spilling orange light across the distant ranges. The land felt larger, with every mile endless grass rolling into foothills, the wind combing it into silver waves. Now and then, Elias glimpsed antelope darting away in the distance. When the first buildings appeared, a saloon, a general store, the squat outline of a grain elevator. He felt the eyes of strangers. A cowboy riding in with dust in his coat and something heavy in his saddlebags was bound to draw notice. Two old men on a bench stopped their conversation and squinted after him. Women carrying baskets slowed their steps. Elias kept his gaze fixed ahead, guiding his horse toward the sheriff's office. The office was small, a single-story wooden building that looked as though it had been bleached nearly white by decades of sun and wind. Its sign "Sheriff" was painted in faded black letters across a warped board that hung crooked above the door. Inside, the place smelled faintly of tobacco and old paper. A desk scarred by years of use filled most of the room. Behind it sat Sheriff Thompson. He was older than Elias expected, a tall man still broad in the shoulders but with a paunch pressing against his vest. His hair was mostly silver now, his mustache thick but equally gray. Lines carved his face, not just from age but from years of weariness. Lines of someone who had seen too much and perhaps chosen to look away too often. Thompson glanced up, eyes tired but sharp. "Help you, stranger." Elias set the satchel down on the desk with a dull thud. "Name's Elias Monroe. I found something on my land. You'll want to see it." The sheriff opened the bag and lifted out the journal. His eyes narrowed as he thumbed the first few pages, lips moving silently as he read. When he turned to the section with Sarah Hayes's name, his hand stilled. For a long time, he said nothing. Then softly, "Sarah Hayes?" His eyes went distant, haunted. "I was still wet behind the ears when she vanished. They told me to chalk it up as a runaway. Family troubles. But I never bought it. A woman like that doesn't just disappear." He set the book down, and Elias placed the earring beside it. Silver caught the light of the desk lamp, a fragile sparkle in the dim office. Thompson's jaw tightened. His hand hovered above the earring, but he didn't touch it. Instead, he looked up, and his voice dropped to a whisper. "Creed." The word carried both loathing and fear. "Franklin Creed?" Elias asked quietly. The sheriff nodded. His eyes flicked to the window, as if even the walls might carry word back to the wrong ears. The Creeds own nearly half this valley. Timber, cattle. They've got money sunk into the bank, the courthouse, even the damn newspaper. Franklin himself runs the biggest spread around. Folks call him a pillar of the community. Hell, every politician within 100 miles owes him a favor. He rubbed his forehead with the heel of his hand, eyes shadowed. And anyone who's ever tried to cross him, they end up ruined, or run out of town, sometimes worse. Thompson leaned forward, lowering his voice further. "I've worn this badge 35 years, Monroe. You know how many times I've heard whispers about Creed. Too many. And you know how many times those whispers ever saw daylight. Not once." The sheriff closed the journal with a heavy hand. His eyes locked on Elias, grim. "You've stumbled onto the one thing this whole town has been afraid to touch for decades." Despite his words, Thompson tried to take the straight path first. He picked up the telephone, the kind with a separate receiver and earpiece, and dialed the county office. Elias sat in silence as he listened to the sheriff's half of the conversation. Thompson reported the discovery, the wagon, the bones, the journal, the threats written in Sarah Hayes's own hand. He requested a warrant for the Creed property, especially the old lumber barn mentioned in the entries. For a moment, Elias allowed himself to believe it might work. but his hope was short-lived. At first, the distant voice on the other end was all polite promises. "We'll review it. We'll see." Then, as the hours passed and calls went back and forth, the tone changed. Finally, a definitive answer came. "Request denied," Thompson repeated flatly, staring at the telephone, as if it had just betrayed him. "Evidence deemed inadmissible." Journal too old to establish credibility. He slammed the receiver down hard enough to make the lamp on his desk wobble. His face flushed with fury. Damn them. For a long time, the office was silent, only the creak of wood as the sheriff pushed back in his chair. Then slowly, he turned toward Elias. "You see how it is," he said, his voice low and bitter. "The law around here doesn't belong to justice. It belongs to men with money. Creed bought his armor a long time ago, and he spent 30 years polishing it with fear." He opened the drawer of his desk, pulled out a bottle, and set it down without bothering to offer. He poured a small measure into a glass, drank, and winced. "I've seen others try. One miner who swore he'd seen Creed with Sarah the night she vanished lost his job, family, forced out of town within a week. Another fellow talked too loud at the saloon, ended up in a ditch after a riding accident. Folks got the message. Nobody's dared mention her name since." Elias sat across from him, the earring between his fingers. The little silver bird gleamed softly, its wings forever outstretched. Such a small thing, yet it carried the weight of a life. "Then the system's already dead," Elias murmured. Thompson's eyes were heavy. "Maybe. But sometimes it only takes one man stubborn enough to stand against it to prove otherwise." Elias didn't answer. He stared at the earring, his jaw set. He knew, as the sheriff did, that by carrying Sarah Hayes' memory into this room, he had crossed a line. The truth was no longer something he could bury. And somewhere beyond the walls of the sheriff's office and the empty fields and mountains, the gray horse still watched, a silent witness to all that had been unearthed. The wind had picked up after sundown, hissing through the birch grove behind the ranch like a whispering choir. Clouds chased the moon across the sky, spreading and breaking, sometimes letting the pale light fall across the sagging barn roof, sometimes plunging the yard into a pool of shadows. Elias sat on the porch steps, with his boots planted firm on the boards. A cigarette smoldered between his fingers, its ember flaring bright with each slow drag, then dulling to ash. He hadn't spoken aloud since the sheriff's office that morning. His mind had been a restless tide, replaying the slammed receiver, the words "request denied," and the look in Thompson's eyes when he admitted the law was shackled. The night smelled of wood smoke and damp earth. Somewhere in the distance, a lone coyote yipped, answered by silence. Elias rubbed the bridge of his nose with a thumb and exhaled smoke into the cold air. He was trying to steady himself when the faint creak of wheels broke the stillness. He looked up. Out beyond the gate, barely visible beneath the moonlight, a small wagon had rolled to a stop. No lantern lit its path. Just the silhouette of a driver, broad-shouldered, who climbed down slowly. The man came on foot, crunching across the gravel. His outline was familiar, even stripped of uniform. A heavy coat hung from his shoulders. No badge, no holstered sidearm in sight. Sheriff Thompson, though the title clung less in that moment than the weariness that seemed to bow his frame. He looked taller without the trappings of office, but older too, as if the weight of years pressed on him double hard when he was only a man. Elias dropped the cigarette into the dirt and ground it out beneath his boot heel. He didn't speak, just waited as Thompson reached the porch. The sheriff paused, breathing heavily, and glanced back toward the road before climbing the steps. His eyes caught Elias's in the half-light, and there was nothing official there, no pretense of authority, only fatigue. "I didn't come here as the law," Thompson said, voice roughened by wind and age. "Not tonight." Inside, the fire had burned low in the stone hearth. Elias stoked it back to life, the flames licking high enough to paint the log walls in gold. The two men sat opposite each other, a table between them scarred by years of use. The sheriff kept his coat on hands, clasped as though to keep them from shaking. For a long time, he simply stared into the fire, letting it fill the silence. Finally, he said almost to himself, "The law's blind here, Elias. Bought and bound. I can't bring Creed down in the courthouse. God knows I've tried, and God knows I've failed." The flames cast half his face in shadow. The other half was carved with guilt. He rubbed his jaw and continued. 30 years ago, when Sarah Hayes vanished, I was new in the badge. I searched, I questioned. Creed's name crossed my mind more than once, but there was nothing, no evidence anyone dared bring forward, nothing I could hold up in court. They told me to let it go, and I did. And I've lived with that cowardice every damn day since. His voice cracked on the last word. He covered it with a cough, then reached for the whiskey Elias had left near the hearth. He didn't pour it, just gripped the bottle, hard knuckles whitening. "When you walked into my office with her journal," he said softly, it was like she was speaking again. "Begging not to be buried a second time. And I can't." His fist tapped the wood of the table steady final. "I won't let that happen." He leaned forward, eyes fierce in the firelight. "I wear a star, but tonight it means nothing. Tonight I'm only a man who owes the dead her truth." Elias sat quiet for a long time. The room smelled of smoke and old pine, the fire popping as it swallowed dry knots. On the table between them lay the hummingbird earring's silver wings, outstretched gleaming whenever the flame flared. He found his gaze locked on it. That single piece of jewelry had outlived its owner, carried her story into his hands, and now demanded an answer. He thought of Sarah Hayes's final words in the journal, the scratch of her handwriting when fear shook her, "I was taken." He thought of her bones curled in the buried wagon, waiting decades to be found. And he thought of the families in town, people who kept their eyes down, who muttered Creed's name like a curse, but never out loud. To accept Thompson's offer was to step into that shadow. It was to fight a man shielded by land money and fear. It was to place himself in the crosshairs of power. For a man who had come to Wyoming to disappear, it was madness. And yet the vision of that skeletal hand reaching through soil as though pleading left him no peace. He had spent years trying to outrun ghosts. This one had caught him. His jaw worked silently before he finally nodded. His voice was low but steady. "If not for the law, then for the truth." The sheriff extended a weathered hand across the table. Elias clasped it, his grip iron. For a moment, the firelight caught both men's eyes, and in that flicker, something passed between them, a covenant not written on paper, but carved into will. They did not speak further. The handshake said enough. A sound split the silence outside, the deep, rolling cry of a horse. Elias rose, crossing to the door. He pushed it open and stepped onto the porch. The night had grown still again. The wind dropped, the clouds thinned. Moonlight washed the pasture in silver. There at the edge where shadow met grass stood the gray stallion. Its coat gleamed like tarnished metal under the moon. The mane, stirred by the faintest breeze, shimmered white as frost. The horse did not move closer. It simply stood, ears pricked, eyes reflecting the firelight spilling from the doorway. Watching. Waiting. Elias felt his chest tighten. He spoke softly, almost to himself. "You heard, didn't you? This is the promise." The stallion stamped once, had lifted high. No sound but the quiet echo of its breath drifting across the field. Yet to Elias, it was enough. The animal was a witness. Perhaps more a guardian bound to the truth that lay unearthed. Behind him, Thompson had come to the doorway, watching in silence. Neither man spoke. For both of them, the horse's presence was as binding as the handshake they had just exchanged. When at last Thompson left, the moon had tipped high overhead. His wagon creaked down the road, wheels crunching softly over the gravel, before fading into the night. The ranch fell still again, but it was no longer the same silence. Elias stood on the porch arms, folded, staring into the dark fields. His face was drawn tight, every line etched deeper by resolve. There would be no turning back now. He had stepped into a storm that had been building 30 years. The path ahead offered no safety, no certainty. But there was no retreat either. The silver stallion lingered at the pasture's edge, its outline faint against the horizon, until Elias finally turned and went inside. For the first time since he had bought the ranch, the solitude around him felt different. Not the peace of escape. The silence now was sharpened, honed by purpose. And Elias Monroe knew the only way forward was through. Sheriff Thompson reached Neil Baxter just after noon when the thin light made the dust in the old forge look like snow. The smithy had been dead for years. Bellows collapsed the anvil, flecked with red rust like dried blood. Neil lived in a narrow shack tacked onto the side, a single room that smelled of coal soot and boiled coffee. He opened the door with a hesitance that had nothing to do with age. He was wiry and stooped with a long, earnest face that avoided the sheriff's eyes. "I don't have trouble anymore," he said, hands twisting the rag he'd used to dry them. "I keep to myself. Folks know. I'm not here to make trouble." Thompson replied, calm and even. He stepped inside without asking, set his hat on the table, then lifted a small cloth bundle from his coat pocket and folded it open. The hummingbird earring lay in his palm, a silver flicker in the dull room. "I'm here about Sarah Hayes." Neil's throat worked. His gaze cut toward the door, as if the wind might be listening. "I don't know anything about." His voice failed him. "Don't," Thompson said gently. "Don't say that. We both know it isn't true." He set the earring on the table and nudged it toward the old man. "You saw something at the Creed lumber barn, didn't you? The day she disappeared." For a time, the only sound was the hum of a fly tracing the window pane. Then Neil sat. He stared at the earring like a sinner stares at an altar. "I told myself it wasn't my business," he whispered. "Told myself the world is too hard on men who poke their nose where the rich tell them not to." He pressed his fingers to his eyes until the skin blanched. "But it was my business." "Because I saw it, say it," Thompson urged. Neil's shoulders quaked once. She was there with him. Sarah, out by the barn. He was angry. God, I can still hear him telling her she'd ruin him if she talked. She said she wasn't his to keep. She said she wasn't afraid. He glanced up, shame burning like fever. He hit her. Hard. She stumbled against the door frame, and one of those little birds, one of her earrings, fell on the wood. I saw it skitter. I almost ran out then. But Creed. He looked up. Neil shivered. He looked at me like he could see through the wall, like he owned the inside of my bones. I backed away, went home, and then she was gone. Tears cut clean tracks through the dust on his cheeks. I figured folks with badges would handle it. Figured if I spoke, he'd burn my life down. 30 years I've lived with it. 30 years of not sleeping right. Thompson drew a notebook and wrote slowly, the pencil scratching, steady as a metronome. He didn't press the old man for more. There was enough in the shape of the words, enough in the breaking voice. When he finished, he closed the book, slid the earring back into his pocket, and stood. "It isn't enough to bring him down," Neil said hoarsely, as if begging the sheriff to save him from hope. No, Thompson answered honest to the bitter end, not by itself. He placed a hand on Neil's shoulder, a weight as gentle as a prayer. But it points the way. Elias found Emily Hayes near evening, when the valley turned soft and the shadows of cottonwoods pushed long fingers toward the river. She lived in a small clapboard house, painted the stubborn blue of memory. The porch was tidy, a basket of mended things by the door socks, darned neat a shirt whose collar had been turned and turned again. She opened to him with suspicion, first then surprise when she saw what he carried. He set the leather journal in her hands. The old satchel thudded softly onto the table. When he produced the earring, the one he'd taken from the buried wagon, Emily stopped breathing. "That's my sister's," she said, and her voice crumpled like paper left in rain. She touched the tiny bird as if afraid it might break. She wore them every day. Mama gave them to her when she got the job with the miners, said they meant hope. "Lord." She closed her eyes, and the tears came quietly like something she'd been too careful to spend for years. She came home one night with only one in her ear. Said she'd lost the other in a scuffle with Mr. Creed at his lumber barn. She was shaking mad. Said he'd grabbed her arm. Said he kept showing up where she worked, telling her who to see and who not to. I told her to tell the sheriff. She said the sheriff was young and the Creeds were old. Emily laughed once a wet, wounded sound. She left for the camp next morning. I never saw her again. Elias let the silence hold. The house smelled of boiled starch and lavender. A clock ticked in the next room, steady as a second heartbeat. "If the other earring is still at the barn," Emily whispered, palm cupped over the silver, "then he can't pretend she was never there. He can't pretend she ran away." "It would be enough," Elias said. He didn't say enough to all but force belief. He didn't say enough to make a jury see. He said simply, it would be enough. She pressed the journal back into his hands with a reverence that felt like blessing. "Bring her home," she said. "Bring the truth home." "I will," he told her, and for once it didn't feel like a man lying to make a grieving person breathe easier. It felt like a fact that waited just ahead in the dark. He laid the bait at the saloon that night. The place always smelled of old beer and floorboards scrubbed too thin. Elias took a seat at the bar, ordered whiskey, and let himself look angry. He hunched his shoulders, cursed softly at the splinter in the counter, made enough noise a man might make when a job has settled wrong in his mind. When a ranch hand he didn't know sidled up and muttered some observation about the weather, Elias answered loud enough for the room. "Weather's fine for digging," he said, "seeing as I'm planning to dig tomorrow." At Creed's old lumber barn. A hush went through the nearest tables, quiet as a held breath. The barkeep's eyes flicked to him, then away the way people do when they don't want to be seen knowing something. A man in a black hat slipped out the side door with exaggerated casualness. Elias drank half his glass and refilled it as if to prove to the room he meant to be slow and clumsy come morning. He left after an hour, staggering a little on purpose on the boardwalk. The night air washed cool over him. In the reflection of the saloon window, he saw what he needed to see: a shadow detach from a stoop, then slide away quick with the news. Good. Let Creed hear that the fool cowboy would be poking around his property tomorrow in full daylight. Let him plan to meet the problem head on. By the time the lamps went out in town, Elias was already riding back roads with Thompson. The moon was a fingernail caught in a rag of clouds. The land swallowed sound. They took no lantern. Thompson tucked a small oil lamp in his coat for the search, but they let the horses feel the trail by habit and hoof. Silver dust appeared without being called, a gray flicker at the edge of the road that settled into Elias's left side like a second thought. The Mustang moved with a serenity that felt like intent. Elias had long ago stopped asking how or why the horse simply arrived when needed. He accepted it, the way a man accepts the sun at dawn. They reached the lumber barn just before midnight. It crouched at the edge of a stand of pines, its roofline caved like a spine after a hard life. The door sagged from its hinges, and when Elias lifted it, the wood spoke with a long, unhappy groan. A smell like damp starch and mouse droppings drifted out. Thompson lit the lamp low. Its small flame made islands of light in the dark sea of the barn. They moved slow, careful to put their boots where the board still held. It was a graveyard of timber-broken yokes, a sagging sawbuck crates furred with mildew. Elias pried with the crowbar at odd seams. He skulked the walls, listening for hollow behind the planks. Nothing. Nothing but the patient tick of the flame and the sound of their breathing. Doubt nibbled at the edges of his resolve. Maybe Emily's memory had shifted with grief. Maybe the earring had been lost elsewhere. Maybe Silver Dust stepped through the broken door and into the lamplight, like an actor hitting his mark. The horse's ear flicked once-twice. Then he moved across the barn without hurry, placing each hoof with the soft certainty of a creature in its own story. He paused in a back corner. The floorboards there looked no different than the rest, gray with age, their tongues wedged and swollen with damp. The horse stamped once, the board beneath. A second time. Then with a quick low nicker, he raked his hoof and the brittle wood splintered. Elias and Thompson stared at each other, something like relief and astonishment warring across both faces. Elias dropped to his knees and wedged the crowbar into the split. The plank peeled up with a sucking sound, bringing a draft of earth smell with it. He lifted another board, then another, until a shallow pocket opened beneath them, a dark seam of dirt where the subfloor had been scooped out long ago and rough-pressed back into place. He set the lamp on a beam and reached into the hollow. The soil was cold and slick. He dug with his fingers, working carefully, moving aside stones, pulling out a sliver of broken glass. Then his thumb struck something smooth. He drew it out into the lamplight. Silver flashed like a fish at the surface. A hummingbird wings lifted tarnish, blackening the creases of its tiny feathers. He felt the air go out of his lungs. Thompson took one breath as if it might be his last, and let it out through his teeth. "That's it," he said hoarsely. "That's the nail he can't pull. That puts her here with him." Elias closed his fist around the earring. It was cold, colder than the night, colder than any metal had a right to be, and it pressed shape into his palm the way a promise presses shape into a man's life. He reached into his coat and drew out Sarah's other earring. Side by side, they made a pair again, as if time could be tricked into companionship. He felt something that might have been Victory's first small spark. He didn't have to name it. He only had to hold it. The barn door exploded inward with a violence that blew dust and splinters into the lamplight. The lamp's flame leaped guttered-held. Elias turned. Franklin Creed stood in the doorway, filling it like a storm front. He had a length of iron in his fist and the kind of grin that men wear when they believe the world belongs to them. "I heard tell you'd come snooping," he said the words oily with delight. "Couldn't wait until morning, huh?" He stepped forward. The barn seemed suddenly small around him. "You think you found something I buried her 30 years ago, and the truth with her. And I'll bury you too, cowboy. I'll bury the law, same as I always have." He swung the iron bar in one lazy arc, testing the weight. His eyes glittered. No one crosses Creed. Elias faced him, shoulders square feet light. Silver Dust slid a half step to the side, a living wall between the men. The horse's ears were pinned, breath pouring hard from flared nostrils. Elias didn't look at the Mustang, but he felt the heat of the animal, the thrum under its skin that thrummed in him too. Creed lunged. The iron bar cut down with a howl. Elias slid to the left. The bar smashed boards, tearing a dangerous gap into the rotten floor. The barn shook with the blow. Enough a voice snapped from the dark, and a second light bloomed Thompson's lamp, flaring higher. The sheriff stepped from the shadows with his pistol leveled, both hands, steady wrists locked in the old stance a man never forgets. "Franklin Creed," he said, and his voice was a bell in a chapel. "You're under arrest for the murder of Sarah Hayes. Drop the iron, now." Creed froze. Surprise sheared across his face, then settled into rage. "You're out of your depth, old man," he hissed. "You and your tin badge, drop it." Thompson repeated and put enough steel in the word to cut bone. For a heartbeat the world held. Then the bar clanged to the floor. "Back against the beam," Thompson ordered. "Hands where I can see them." He took 2 slow steps forward, never letting the sights drift from Creed's chest. Elias. Elias moved like a man who had been waiting for this his whole life. He came around behind Creed, snatched the rope he'd coiled across his shoulder, and in 3 practiced motions looped it over the man's wrists, cinched and jerked, then wound the slack around a post. Creed tried to twist free, but rage had stripped him of subtlety. He was only muscle and anger, and neither helped him now. Silver dust threw his head and screamed. The sound filled the barn, filled the night beyond it, wild and clean, like thunder over rock. It rolled so long and fierce that Elias felt the boards under his boots vibrate with it. A testimony, he thought, and didn't know why the word fit so perfect. Thompson recited the rites in a voice that did not tremble. The last word sounded like an amen. Creed sagged a fraction. Some glamour shattered in him then. The decades of impunity slid off like rainfall over tar. He glanced at the hole in the floor where his bar had broken wood and laughed once short and mean. "You think a couple of trinkets will hang me," he muttered. But there was fear in it now. Fear and something else, a man feeling the edges of the pit he'd dug for himself so long, he called it home. "Not trinkets," Elias said. He held up the matched earrings, tiny birds flashing in the lamp's shine. "Witnesses." Maybe it was the word. Maybe it was the horse. Maybe it was 30 years of rot finally giving way under its own weight. Whatever it was, the arrogance went out of Creed like a punctured lung. His shoulders slumped. His mouth quirked in a broken smile. "She wouldn't listen," he said. The confession came quiet, almost conversational, the way a man remembers the shape of a storm that killed his crop. She had no sense. She was going to talk. About me? About the contracts? The men I paid to keep order? She said I didn't own her. Said no man did. He glanced at the dark where the door yawned. I tried to reason. I tried to scare her. I only meant to. He shut his eyes, jaw jumping. I hit her. She fell wrong. Head on the wheel rim. She stopped moving. The barn held the words the way a church holds breath after a sermon. I made it right, he snapped, suddenly anger flaring, as if it could cauterize the truth. I put her where no one would find her. Filled the wagon with dirt. Took it to the field at night. Buried it. Scared that fool Baxter quiet. And when anyone whispered, I made sure they didn't whisper long. He drew a breath that scraped. 30 years. 30 years I kept this valley clean. 30 years you kept it filthy with fear, Thompson said. The gun never wavered. And it ends tonight. They marched him out of the barn, between them, Silver Dust pacing at Elias's shoulder like a deputy from some older law. The sheriff's wagon creaked loud in the dark, eager to be useful. They tied Creed in the back and set off toward town. The road lifted dust that settled on the man's fine coat and turned it the same color as the rest of the world. It was dawn before the cell door clanged shut. Thompson stood staring at the iron bars long after the keys stopped rattling. He looked older then, but not tired. Something in him had eased something he'd carried so long it had become part of how he stood. He sent for Emily 2 days later. She came in a plain dress with her hair pulled back the bones of her face, more beautiful for the grief that had shaped them into strength. Thompson laid the journal and the matched earrings on the desk as though he were setting down a crown. Emily lifted the birds with both hands and pressed them to her breast. A sound left her that wasn't quite a sob. It was too full for that. She looked at Elias, and there was a light in her eyes that had not existed the week before. "She never left us," Emily said. "You brought her back." She took Elias's rough hand and squeezed it, not like a woman thanking a rescuer, but like a sister acknowledging another who had chosen to kneel at the same grave and refuse silence. "You brought my sister home." Elias could only nod. He had never known what to do with praise. He settled for truth. "She found me first," he said. "Her and a horse." Creed did not fight long. Faced with the earrings, the journal, Neil Baxter's statement, and the sight of the wagon itself, a hole in the field like an open eye, his bluster curdled to arithmetic. He talked, and the talk closed the circle. The story made a kind of terrible sense that left no room for doubt. By the week's end, the story had swallowed the valley. The newspaper printed what it dared. The men who had taken money to look away pretended they had been blind, all along not bought. Women held their children tighter when they passed the courthouse steps. In the saloon, someone said Sarah's name out loud and didn't lower his voice. Truth has a sound when it comes up out of the earth. It isn't loud, it isn't kind, but it carries. On a late afternoon, heavy with the smell of frost, Elias took his coffee to the porch steps of the ranch. The fields rolled toward the foothills in a color that wasn't green anymore, wasn't brown, yet some in-between shade the land wears when it's exhaling. He wrapped both hands around the tin mug and watched the steam lift and vanish. Silver Dust approached from the pasture with the self-possession of a king. He stopped beside the steps and lowered his head until the soft triangle between his eyes rested against Elias's shoulder. The warmth of the animal soaked into him like a benediction. Elias slid his palm up the horse's neck and into the thick mane. "We did it," he said, voice low. "We did what was asked." The Mustang breathed out a sound like wind in a canyon, and Elias smiled despite himself. He had never believed in omens. He had believed in work. But the line between the two had blurred lately, and he did not mind. Evening rose like tide. When the sun finally tipped its brim to the ridgeline, the sky set itself on fire orange at first, then a red that reminded Elias of the paint he'd uncovered on the wagon. Then a violet bruising that made the mountains look near enough to touch. The silence that came with it wasn't the hush he'd found when he first arrived, the kind that keeps secrets and starves the soul. This was a clean silence scrubbed by grief and the truth that follows it. He watched the field where the earth had been opened. Grass had already begun to stitch the wound. From here, if a stranger rode by, he might never know what lay beneath. That felt right. The land could heal. The people would remember. He drew a breath that went all the way down and stayed. Somewhere behind him in the house, Sarah's journal lay on the table, closed, not forgotten, finished. "You can stand down," he told the horse softly, And if he meant it for himself too, neither of them argued. The last light drained from the west. Cold came on. Elias rose bones, creaking like a well-used porch, and the horse lifted his head to follow. They lingered a minute longer, because men and horses both understand the worth of endings when they're well-earned. Then Elias tapped the mug against his boot heel, a small private salute, and turned toward the door. There would be mornings again, and fences to mend, and snow to shovel from the barn roof, and coffee to drink in the kind of quiet that doesn't hurt. Work would make its old, honest claims. But now the place had a different center. It had a grave where a wagon once lay, and a truth where a lie had slept, and those two facts had shifted the weight of everything. Sometimes justice comes wearing a badge. Sometimes it comes on 4 hooves, dragging a man by the heart into ground he'd rather not dig. Either way, when it comes, the land knows. It holds the echo long after voices go silent. Elias stepped inside. The door closed on the soft sounds of the ranch settling. Out in the pasture, silver dust let out a quiet, satisfied whicker that melted into the deepening dark. The valley breathed. And for the first time since he'd turned his horse north, Elias Monroe felt the fullness of a silence that wasn't hiding anything